Hello team, welcome to another ATP Geopolitics video with myself, Jonathan MS Pearce. Ukraine War News Update, second part thereof for the 25th of October 2024. This is a two-day geopolitics update, and as a result, there's an awful lot of content to get through because there's an awful lot going on in the world. We've had the BRICS event in Kazan in Russia. We have North Korea getting involved in the war. We've got all sorts going on with two revelatory pieces in the Wall Street Journal that we're going to talk about. There's just an awful lot going on. So I will try and rush through this as quickly as possible, but this is big stuff and it might take a bit of time. Okay, we're going to start with Russia transfers technology for nuclear weapons to North Korea in exchange for people and missiles, according to Censor.net. According to the head of Defense Intelligence Service of Ukraine, Russia is helping the DPRK, the North Koreans, circumvent sanctions and strengthen its nuclear capabilities. Thus, Russia is transferring some technologies for low-yield tactical nuclear weapons and underwater missile launch systems. This is a worry. North Korea getting involved in the war in Ukraine is not a bit of charity for Russia. There's a quid pro quo here. What do North Korea get for that? What is the quid for the quo? And it is that technology that means that North Korea will become even more of a threat to the wider world. We know they're always testing ballistic missiles. You start putting nuclear warheads on these missiles being sent from someone like Kim Jong-un, who doesn't appear to be the most level-headed kind of guy. I mean, he got an anti-aircraft gun and blew out, what was his uncle or something? He destroyed on an airfield. He just executed him with an anti-aircraft gun. I mean, this guy is not the sanest of people, and here we are apparently allowing North Korea to get involved in this war. Of course, like I've said to you before, I think things will be going on frantically beneath the radar in terms of how do we respond to that as a wider West. Now, Russia has threatened South Korea amidst the arrival of the North Korean military, according to Russian media. This is reported in Ukrainska Pravda. We believe the South Korean authorities should not be playing along with the Kiev regime, is the quote from good old Maria Zakharova. Now, this is the kind of projection, isn't it? It's ridiculous. It's like like saying to someone, it's saying to a woman that's being mugged, oh, you shouldn't be hitting the mugger. I think you're playing with fire, you're going to hit the mugger, without saying, oh yeah, no, the mugger shouldn't be mugging you. It's absolutely ridiculous. Complete almost victim blaming here. It's like blaming South Korea for getting involved when Russia signed a bilateral security agreement with North Korea and got them formally involved in the war. It's absolutely insane. So Zakharova warned the Republic of Korea, quote, of the consequences for South Korea's security that could result from the Republic of Korea's involvement in the Ukrainian conflict if such decisions were made. The Russian Federation will indeed react harshly to any steps that may pose a threat to the security of the country, its citizens, wherever its citizens are. These measures can be quite tangible. Just absolutely incredible. Anyway, satellites show that North Korea profits from supporting Russia's war in Ukraine, says the Euromaidan press. North Korea's nighttime glow has intensified since 2022, satellite data shows. So the quid pro quo, of course, gets a bit of, I mean, the quid is giving the Russians North Korean soldiers, and the quo is lighting up the country a little more brightly than it may already have been, as well as receiving nuclear technology. So North Korea might well be something of, might well be moving towards a little bit of greater energy use due to, well, I guess, if you're going to get anything from the Russians, hydrocarbons and energy, I presume it's going to be something they can offer. So yeah, North Korea definitely appear to be, I'm not sure I can use them together, but they appear to be profiting from helping out Russia already. Now, Russia is sending the first 1,500 North Koreans against Ukraine to test the world's reaction, says the Netherlands. The initial deployment should help Russia test the soldiers and the international reaction, according to Dutch Defense Minister Ruben Brekelmans, according to the Kiev Independent here. And that is an interesting view on that. Brekelmans called the move a clear escalation and said the West must present an appropriate response. Other countries provided much higher estimates of the numbers North Korea is sending, while the US said that This concerns 3,000 soldiers. Ukraine said that Pyongyang has already sent nearly 12,000 troops to Russia, including 500 officers and 3 generals. The move signals deepening cooperation between Pyongyang and Moscow, after North Korea also supplied Russia with artillery shells and ballistic missiles. So there are claims that the first troops are already in Kursk, or certainly on the way. And this has caused Mike Turner, the Republican sitting on the House Intelligence Committee, to say if North Korean troops were to invade Ukraine's sovereign territory, the US needs to seriously consider taking direct military action against them. This is really escalatory. What's going to be super interesting is to see what the wider Republican community say, because there are particularly on the MAGA side of things, there are these beliefs that the US shouldn't keep supporting Ukraine, that Putin's okay, that Russia's okay. But it's much more difficult to say Russia's okay if you have on board with Russia as their kind of best mates Iran, China and North Korea. These are nations that actually even the MAGA Americans are generally reluctant to say, yeah, they're all right. They can just about get away with it with Putin, partly because of Putin's positioning on traditional values, and they see him as kind of representing Christian nationalism to a degree. I mean, we can get into the long weeds of whether that is at all what he actually believes, but there's definitely been a co-opting of, let's say, the Russian Orthodox Church and Christian traditional values to appeal to some of the electorate in the US. That means that there's this social moral connection being made, and that allows for permission for Russia to do things on the kind of military political level and get away with it with some of these American voters because, hey, they hate the gays type thing. Yeah. Interesting. So here we have a traditional Republican in the Reagan sort of mold saying, actually, this is super serious and we need to potentially be thinking of how we react to this in a direct military fashion. The European Union is deeply alarmed by reports that North Korea is sending troops to participate in Russia's illegal war of aggression against Ukraine. This would constitute a serious breach of international law, including the most fundamental principles of the UN Charter. Deep concerns, though. Deep concerns, yeah, okay. What does that mean in terms of tangible action? And the same can be said about the UN. How does Russia get to stay on the UN Security Council, for frick's sake, when they are clearly doing very close cooperation with North Korea that has been very heavily sanctioned by UN resolutions? It's just absolutely mind-boggling. Now, there are new details emerging in Moldova's vote buying scandal. So the Moldovan police report that $24 million was transferred from Russia via Promsvyazbank in October alone, aimed at bribing voters ahead of the elections. The scheme, linked to fugitive oligarch Elon involves over 520 suspects and the use of bots to manipulate votes. And of course, with a smaller population, fewer votes are needed to skew the election. And actually, you can get a pretty decent return on investment to make sure that Moldova stays under your sphere of influence. Of course, that seemed to fail. But yeah, Russia, as I said, we're involved in a world war with Russia. I keep saying this. And that war is taking place in all these different domains, in all these different ways. Here we've got a sort of bribery, electoral, political war going on with Moldova. But the larger landscape of interference with Moldova is interference with the EU. This is a country that is seeking to accede to the EU. And actually, this is really, it's not so much an attack on Moldova, but it's an attack on the EU, or it's stopping the EU from receiving support from Eastern Europe. And Russia is involved in all these different dimensions of war with us. Finland is completely closing 2 temporary checkpoints on its border with Russia. The checkpoints are in question are Parakkala and Inari. Traffic at Parakkala was stopped in April and Inari on November. They've now cited a sharp influx of migrants from Africa and the Middle East as a reason for closing the checkpoints. I know some people say this is an excuse to sort of clamp down on migration, and then others will say, but there is actually evidence to suggest, and I've previously cited newspaper articles and interviews of the actual migrants who have been prompted and supported by Russia in going to Finland. The question is this genuine migration, or is this influenced by Russia in terms of trying to upset social cohesion in places like Finland, using migration in a way that Belarus has been doing that supposedly with Poland certainly since I think 2013 onwards. A glamorous Russian influencer known as the Queen of Crypto has scammed unsuspecting investors out of $22 million that she has sent to Ukrainian troops amid the ongoing war, says the New York Post. Interesting story there. I don't have time to look into that in too much detail, but I think hopefully that sounds like money well scammed to me. Okay. All for the greater good, right? Moral consequentialism going on there. Right, during the BRICS summit, so we're going to go on and talk about BRICS and NATO, actually. During the BRICS summit that's taken place in Kazan, the Belarusian dictator Lukashenko defended his country's support for Russia in an interview with the BBC. He emphasized Russia is an ally and stated that Belarus would support it for as long as needed. Drawing a parallel with NATO's backing of Ukraine, he argued that he is protecting a common homeland with Russia. Stretching from Brest to Vladivostok, and vowed to stand by his ally just as Western nations support Ukraine. Lukashenko's not stupid, though. He knows that he's only in power because Putin put him there. And in fact, it was a very volatile moment with lots of protests when he did essentially illegally take power back in the last election. He knows that he's not there because of the democratic will of his people. And therefore, his support for Russia is a very nuanced one. He does only as much as he has to do in order to keep Putin on side, but actually doesn't go nearly as far as Putin wants him to. Putin would love him to put his Belarusian army into the front lines, but he knows that basically 2/3 of his army would up sticks and protest, and you'd have a civil war in your hands. So the Belarusians are not traditionally massive fans of Russia these days. It's rather like Ukraine, where you've got certain people who are under that sphere of influence and look rosily upon the Soviet era, and you've got other people who would actually like to take the country further to the west and towards Europe. So Lukashenko knows this, and he'll say things very publicly like this, but actually he doesn't really do it enough as far as Putin's concerned. If you remember, his foreign minister was assassinated, or suddenly died, but he was assassinated by Russia since the beginning of this war because he was starting to sound off about support for Russia. And that was a shot across the bow of Lukashenko to say, look, mate, you're next if you don't toe the party line. So, there is a certain existential connection to Russia with Lukashenko. Like, he might end up not existing if he doesn't say these sorts of things. That's not to support Lukashenko, but it's to understand what he says and why he says it. But he is a dictator, and goodness me, it would be great to see democracy return to Belarus. India. So in terms of BRICS, India has blocked Turkey's accession to BRICS, apparently, according to Debunked, because of Ankara's good relations with Pakistan. So Turkey has good relations with Pakistan. India hates Pakistan, and you've got Kashmir in between. That is a region that is hotly fought over between those two nations. Publication quoted Sinan Ulgen, a former diplomat of Turkish foreign policy at the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace, as saying that Erdogan wants a rapprochement with Putin's alliance in order to strengthen Turkey's strategic autonomy. The second reason for Erdogan's move, according to Ulgen, is his intention to show that he can simultaneously sit at the tables of NATO and BRICS and mediate in the international arena. Of course, by being in BRICS and NATO would make Turkey in a unique position and probably quite powerful in terms of politics. And you might get an economic boon off the back of that, I don't know. He is trying to put himself and Turkey right in the middle of everything. You could argue, cynically speaking, that's quite clever. From a NATO Western point of view, that's really compromising Turkey to a huge degree. So we'll see how that turns out. And then more problems with BRICS here. South Africa accuses Russia of lying over BRICS' loan announcement. So there are issues between all of these different people. TASS reported that according to chairman of the Russian State Corporation, Igor Shuvalov, China and South Africa signed an agreement with VEB.RF on credit lines in national currencies, but VEB.RF is sanctioned, and, quote, the Development Bank of South Africa, DBSA, has denied that it signed a credit line deal with the sanctioned Russian state-owned giant VEB.RF, as reported in Russian media. So there are lots of arguments over what's actually going on with regard to BRICS loans and whatnot. All of this points to an uncomfortable relationship between BRICS nations and potential BRICS nations, which leads some people to give this kind of analysis. And I'm going to go on to talk about what I've been saying in terms of BRICS and why I'm worried about BRICS. And I get slammed every day by people saying, you don't know what you're talking about. You are thinking BRICS is more of a threat than it really is. And I'm going to qualify myself and bring some receipts at least. So BRICS has achieved very little over 15 years, says Jim O'Neill, the former Goldman Sachs chief economist that coined the acronym. The idea that BRICS can be made a genuine global economic club is obviously a bit out there with the fairies, and it's very disturbing. And they see themselves as some kind of alternative global thing because it's obviously not feasible. I will take the BRICS group seriously when I see signs that the two countries that really matter, China and India, are actually really trying to agree on things rather than effectively trying to confront each other all the time. Now, this is true, right? So, like I've said to you before, BRICS is a marriage of convenience, and most of these countries are not ideologically aligned. They are very transactional countries. India and China both have 1 billion people and want to do what's best for their people in terms of food, economy, energy, etc., etc. So they'll be screwing Russia over, who's part of BRICS, for cheap as chips hydrocarbons. They don't care that they're in a kind of group, a cozy group with Russia, and they should be matey. It's like, no, we're going to use you to get cheap hydrocarbons. However, BRICS has changed, although it says it's achieved very little. The fact is that BRICS grew from 4 nations in 2006 to now like double that size easily, plus 36 nations turned up to the meeting in Kazan, and there were lots of people that want to join. And you got huge hitters like Malaysia in Asia, wanting to have a piece of the apple, Saudi Arabia, UAE, so on and so forth. This is, I think, if you ignore this, then more fool you. So lots of people have written articles on whether BRICS is a threat. Can an expanding BRICS challenge the global order? Says Yahoo Finance here. This is Daniel Coughlin. So this is written some time back, sort of a month and a half ago. And it talks about all the issues BRICS is. It talks about the history of BRICS and how it started just as these 4 nations. And South Africa kind of made BRICS the capital S rather than a small s. And then the kind of growing BRICS membership, disparate growth, expanding remit. So while economic growth rates were once robust among every one of the 5 BRICS nations, they now vary wildly. India continues to record impressive figures, but Brazil, Russia and South Africa have been flagging for several years. Meanwhile, China's growth forecast this next year has been downgraded to a relatively meager 5%, down from 12.7% in 2006, the year the group first met. Analysts have also started to doubt whether China can take over the US in terms of GDP of which once expected to achieve by 2030. This is a really good point, and one that Joe Scarborough made the other day on Bill Maher, where he said, I don't understand these people that are doing down the US economy, and saying, Bidenomics hasn't worked, etc., etc. The American GDP has just improved massively, and actually Chinese GDP has stalled at 17 trillion or whatever it is, and it's not looking like it's going to overtake the US. But my point is always not about what BRICS is right now, but looking at the trajectory of BRICS and where it might be in 50 years. Now, you can say it might not be there in 50 years, it might fall apart. Yeah, okay, and you can leave that to the vagaries of chance, right? Or you can try and do something about it as an insurance policy. And I think it's ill-advised to just sit back and go, BRICS ain't anything to worry about, it's going nowhere. When you've got Turkey, a member of NATO, and wants to be a member of EU, going in the other direction and deciding to join BRICS. that is a threat. That's a threat to NATO, and it is a threat to the EU in a sense. Interesting article here, looking at all the challenges, conflicts of interests, and all this kind of stuff. Now, turning point. Although trade between BRICS countries has failed to grow significantly for much of its existence, the conflict in Ukraine has marked a turning point. And this is kind of where I've been coming in, saying, actually, what's happened alongside the Ukraine war is that there have been some in the global south that are positioning themselves effectively with Russia and China and not with the US and the West. China and India have been binging on cut-price Russian oil. Brazil wants to buy vast quantities of diesel and fertilizer from the embargoed country, and South Africa has been seriously considering snapping up cheap Russian oil. And a group's second wind hasn't gone unnoticed by other developing countries. BRICS linchpin China has been especially eager to expand the group. As a host of the bloc summit in 2022, she invited the governments of 13 countries to attend a virtual event. In alphabetical order, they were Algeria, Argentina, Cambodia, Egypt, Ethiopia, Fiji, Indonesia, Iran, Kazakhstan, Malaysia, Senegal, Thailand, and Uzbekistan. Now, of the guest countries that attended the summit, Iran and Argentina quickly applied to join BRICS. However, Argentina U-turned on plans to join the bloc in December last year, following the election of its new president, Javier Milei, who claimed his government's foreign policy differs in many ways from that of the previous government. Turkey has become the latest country to show interest in joining the alliance, suggesting the nation is keen to be identified by its long-term allegiance to the West. The country has never successfully joined the European Union, which some analysts argue has been a point of contention. Former White House official Matthew Breiser believes Turkey's BRICS bid is an attempt to spook the West a bit, though only time will tell whether any underlying fears are justified. But the point is that in 2022, when she held that meeting, there were, 13 countries were invited to attend. And this year it's 36. So just in 2 years, we've seen almost a tripling of interest to join. So you might laugh BRICS off as being a disparate bunch of people who aren't doing a good job of working together. But, as it goes on to say, membership of the group could be a welcome bonus for Iran's economic prospects, can allow the nation to offset US sanctions. Iran joined the Shanghai Cooperation Organization. So already they're part of this larger, Chinese group, which already includes China, Russia, and India in September 2022. So the nation has existing ties with BRICS members. Malaysia's to join. So as previously mentioned, Iran officially joined BRICS in January alongside Egypt, Ethiopia, and the UAE. So you've got there another 4 nations on board. And Malaysia seems set to become the 11th country in the alliance. So that is to say, the 11th would be, BRICS was Brazil, Russia, India, China, South Africa, 5. Well, it was 4 in 2006, then 5, and now it's looking like 11. So that's doubled in relatively short amount of time just recently. There are loads of issues with this. But there are other members wanting to join. Latin American members might be on the cards as well. And that could be a bit of an issue for the US. Yes, there are conflicting interests, conflicting forecasts and whatnot. But to ignore BRICS, I think, is something you do at your own peril. And there are plenty of articles out there that say BRICS is nothing to worry about. And there are articles that say BRICS is something to worry about. And essentially, we don't know, because actually this is a prediction about the future. My point is insurance policies. You don't go, it's nothing to worry about. I'm never going to get, a tornado's never going to come through here, so I'm not going to get house insurance. And then a tornado comes through and you haven't got house insurance. Although this is slightly different, because actually this is about a causal influence on the future. So me getting insurance on a house doesn't causally impact whether the house gets taken out by a tornado. However, if our insurance policy at the moment is putting things in place so that BRICS does not come to fruition in a way that threatens the global hegemony. Like, if you are the US wanting to maintain yourself at the top of that ladder, with the dollar being the international currency, then you probably want to be putting things in place so that BRICS doesn't become as popular, as successful as it might. Now, a lot of this might just look like your Indo-Chinese policy. A lot of this might look like stuff that you would do just in terms of your China strategy. But so your China strategy will, to some degree, be your BRICS strategy. But acknowledge that this will have an effect on BRICS. I mean, here's a piece from the Ripon Forum, the emerging threat of BRICS, led by Russia and China, this 9-nation coalition. Well, now, when was this written? April 2024. So actually, already BRICS is bigger since April than this article or this piece in the Ripon Forum states. So led by Russia and China, this 9-nation coalition has one goal: to weaken the United States. I mean, that is the goal. So either you do nothing about it or you do something about it. I mean, the article ends, some have dismissed, and I get messages, and you guys know who you are, Michael Future, Aussie Bugger, people say, let's stop banging on about BRICS, you don't have a clue what you're talking about, that kind of stuff. And that may be, but this is about just predicting the future. And the trajectory at the moment has gone like that. Now, it can continue to go like that, in which case you've got a problem in 50 years, or it magically doesn't go like that. But just, we need to be aware, and we can't just dismiss it, I don't think, out of hand. As your man here says, some have dismissed the BRICS threat on the grounds that its members have different and sometimes conflicting interests. And we saw that in the Yahoo article. This misses the point. While membership may change, BRICS will fundamentally remain a coalition of nations opposed to America's role in the world. As of yet, not enough attention is being paid to this still emerging threat to our national interests. There may come a day when America must take direct action to discourage BRIC membership. But today, fortunately, our weapons against the BRICS threat are also good things for America: limited government, reducing the debt, enacting pro-growth policies, encouraging individual liberty and the rule of law. By remaining true to our fundamental values, America can set an example for other countries to follow, which may be the best deterrent of all. In other words, using the carrot rather than the stick. But even then, it's part of a strategy. What I'm saying is you need to embed as part of your international foreign policy strategy an understanding that BRICS might become a much more viable threat than it presently is. And so whether it's like we're going to do something to upset the apple cart brick, or we are just going to do really good things here so that we attract people to us rather than to them, is still part of a strategy that involves doing something about BRICS, right? Anyway, there is you can go and find, as I say, many articles going both ways on the BRICS things. I just think, do something rather than nothing. ICC decides to punish Mongolia for refusing to arrest Putin. So if you remember, Putin went over to Mongolia recently and they didn't arrest him, even though they're signatories to the Rome Statute that means the International Criminal Court's arrest warrant for Putin on accounts of child deportation, etc., with Maria Lvova-Belova. Mongolia should have arrested Putin, but they didn't. The International Criminal Court has referred Mongolia's case to the Rome Statute member states over its refusal to arrest and extradite Putin to the court during his visit to the country. Good. New EU foreign policy chief Kaja Kallas has dropped the three-way definition of China. This is fascinating. It's these little things that I think tell you an awful lot. As partner, competitor, and systemic rival. So that's how the EU used to see China. A partner, but also a competitor, and also a systemic rival. So it's this, how do we work with China as well as against it in maybe a collegiate but competitive way. She wants to, quote, and now that definition has changed, it's now only called a systemic rival. She wants to, quote, safeguard the EU's geopolitical and economic security vis-a-vis Beijing, and criticises China's support for Russia. This is setting China on a very different, relationship with China on a very different path, I think. I was listening to, goodness me, it's probably about a year and a half ago, a podcast with someone like, it wasn't General Milley, it was someone else, military at some strategic CSIS event or something. And he was talking about it might have been an interview on Ukraine, the latest actually. He was talking about how we see China is really important, and actually, we should see them as a competitor in a kind of economic sense rather than a sworn enemy. But actually, here's the EU saying, they are not quite the rhetoric of a sworn enemy, but they're a systemic rival as opposed to a partner and a competitor. And that's been dropped. Later in her answers to the European Parliament, which she's still needs to approve, Kallas says China would at least partly seek to weaponize the EU's dependency on it and exploit the openness of our societies against us. Fascinating. And yeah, there are weaknesses with democracies. Like, we all want the world to exist in democracies, but there are advantages to democracies, obviously, but there are also some weaknesses. I've talked about previously how Xi Jinping is in quite a privileged position for the benefit of China to be able to do like 25-year strategizing in a way that elected governments don't do because it's impractical for them to do so. What's the point of investing in the UK, for example, in some massive thing that you'll only see the payback for that in 25 years' time? That would be great for the country. You're putting things in place that cost an awful lot of money for the benefit of the country on a long-term basis. But when you're existing on a 4 to 5 year election cycle, then what are you doing that for? That's not going to get you elected, and that's not going to get people saying, oh, that's a good use of money 4 or 5 years into you spending that money. And that's like, there's 21 more years for that to come to fruition. Well, that's a waste of time. We've got hospitals and schools that you could have put money into right now in the last few years. Now, China, Xi Jinping can go, well, I'm going to be in power forever, for the rest of my life. And after I die, it's going to be some other part of the Communist Party framework. So what we're going to do now is we're going to put things in place that are going to link to that, and that's going to link to that, and that's in this 25-year plan that we have for the country. We could do that because I'm not existing on a 4 to 5 year re-election cycle, and that's an advantage. And China can look at countries like there's countries in the EU, free countries, democratic countries, to say, here's a weakness based on the fact that they're existing on these democratic cycles and they have freedom and openness, and we're gonna use that. We are not free and open. We don't allow information into China in such a way. So it's very hard for the outside to disinform Chinese. But we can disinform the Europeans. We can use their freedom of press against them. We can use freedom of speech. And this is what happens. Like, people often on the political right in the US and Europe talk about, oh, freedom of speech, we have freedom of speech, you should have it. And of course, that just allows you to be manipulated. You need to be careful with freedom of speech. With rights come responsibilities. And we need to be careful of people who are manipulating us because we have this freedom of speech. Because we can't do it the other way. Because they shut down those information highways. And so this idea that China can utilize our systems against us because they're free and open is an interesting idea, and I think something to consider. Now, Putin has started talking about the need to reform the UN. So this is at the BRICS meeting where Guterres, the Secretary General of the UN, listened with an unhappy face. A country that is illegally in the UN, and of course, we can see that. Go and look at my video live chat with Talaria, where we talked about how Russia aren't even entitled to, it's not even a seat at the UN. There aren't a set number of seats at the UN Security Council. They're not entitled to be there at all. It's not like the seat should have gone from from the Soviet Union to some new iteration of the Soviet Union, or indeed that could have been Ukraine as much as it could have been the Russian Federation. It's that's not a permanent seat, as in there's not a set number of seats. So, if the Soviet Union ceased to exist, if the USSR ceased to exist, then that seat ceases to exist. And in order to get onto the UN Security Council, you need to apply to the UN formally as a new nation of the Russian Federation, not just assume that position in the UN on the back of the USSR. And then you need to make a case for being a part of the UN Security Council. That never happened. You're not entitled to be there. So the country is illegally in the UN, says Anton Gerashchenko, and broke the global security order and instructs the UN about reform. That is what the world will look like further on if Russia succeeds. Absolutely, terrible there. So Putin, it says next, humiliated the UN Secretary General, who came to bow to a Russian dictator. Putin, in instructive fashion, demanded that the UN be reformed by flooding the UN Security Council with Russian proxy third world countries, the dictatorial regimes of Asia, Africa, and Latin America. Secretary General Guterres swallowed this, but his face clearly expressed displeasure. What are you doing there, mate? And actually, speaking of Talaria, in her Knowledge is Power Substack, she's got an article, Guterres is a Russian asset, corruption in the United Nations. Corrupt UN Secretary General since 2016, Guterres has lied that Russia is a member of the United Nations, concealed fraud, facilitated corruption and terror, and sabotaged the UN. I'll try and link all of my links here in maybe in a pinned comment, because there'll be so many links from this video that it won't fit in the description. So I think a comment can have more links. Oh no, I can't do links in the comments, so I can't do that. Yeah, I'll try and put this one in there anyway, because I think it's important. So go and check that out if you want to find more information on Guterres not being fit for purpose. Now, German Chancellor Olaf Scholz and Slovak President Peter Pellegrini, he's in the Russian sphere of influence of president. Remember, Prime Minister Robert Fico certainly is. Anyway, these two agree that Ukraine's NATO membership is currently unrealistic. During Pellegrini's visit to Berlin, they discussed the need for a more pragmatic approach to the war in Ukraine and its future. This has annoyed some people because that is point number one on Zelensky's victory plan. Ukraine's presidential office refutes media reports that 7 NATO member countries oppose Ukraine joining the NATO alliance. The statement responds to earlier Politico reporting that claimed that US, Germany, Hungary, Slovakia, Slovenia, Belgium and Spain are opposed to Ukraine's NATO accession. Quote, the idea of inviting Ukraine is supported by the absolute majority of the member states, and active advocacy work is being conducted on the rest, Zelensky's spokesperson stated. Interesting stuff. We'll see how those wrangles continue. Right. Here we have JD Vance, so we're going on to some US things, and this is typical egregious posturing from the vice presidential nominee for the Republican Party under Trump.
And Russia shouldn't have invaded Ukraine in the first place. Both the Russians and the Ukrainians are exhausted. They're both struggling to find men, because primarily men in those countries that are fighting the war, but they're struggling to find women too. They're struggling to get the equipment necessary to send to the front lines. Their economies are exhausted. Whole parts of their country have been destroyed. Both of these parties want this war to end. And I think, unfortunately, you've got...
So that's the egregious part. And it starts off, and it is actually, that starts in the middle of what he said. His statements are actually a bit longer, and the bit before would have been quite interesting as well. But he says in the middle of his kind of Ukraine-Russia spiel, he says that he kind of begrudgingly admits that, well, yeah, Russia did invade, but he doesn't really apply any moral evaluation of that. And that's what's missing from the Trump-Vance ticket, is there is no rhetoric involved in saying that Putin is a murderous dictator. There's no moral evaluation of Putin's actions. There's like, oh yeah, Russia invaded, and then we'll go on. And then it's both Sides-ism. So what he goes on to say is that both sides want to end this war, when there's absolutely no indication from the Russians that they want to end this war. If they wanted to end this war, they would frickin' pull out of Ukraine, you dimwit. Right? So all you are doing is giving Russian appeasement. This is an egregious statement that is quite easy. If you were uncritical and if you were a low information voter, you would listen to this and go, oh yeah. Oh, both sides do want to stop, don't they? Yeah, why isn't it stopping? Guy, it must be the Ukrainians' fault or the West's fault or NATO's fault, right? It's just utterly insanely framed, this. It's just so wrong. It should be framed like this. Russia invaded Ukraine, which is a sovereign nation. It invaded the territory of a sovereign nation on the borders of Europe, and has committed tens of thousands, maybe hundreds of thousands of war crimes. And this has been an absolutely egregious act of a dictator on a democratic nation. Russia have no intention to stop this war until they get what they want. So we need to ensure that Russia does not get what it wants. But instead, he says, oh, both sides want to stop. It's horrible. Lots of people are dying. It's a horrible thing, isn't it, war? And so we should just make both sides stop.
Have been destroyed. Both of these parties want this war to end. And I think, unfortunately, you've got a lot of American leaders who like to beat their chest and say, well, this is the good guy and that's the bad guy. Look, yes, Russia should not have invaded Ukraine, but we are where we are. And what's in the best interest of America and what I believe is in the best interest of Ukraine and Russia is for the killing to stop.
And it's this classic, and we've heard that. And, you know, again, he mentioned that, Russia started the war. On the end of, like, people beat their chests as if it's wrong to say these are the good guys, these are the bad guys. Oh, yeah, no, let's move away from, yes, Russia invaded. Yeah, okay. It's not as simple as that. It's not as, you can't just hand wave an invasion involving that caused the death of all these people. You talk about the death of these people on both sides, how terrible it is that there's killing and they both want to stop. They invaded, they caused the killing, and they don't want to stop. So everything, the way that you frame this is entirely wrong. And then you're basically...
The best interest of America, and what I believe is in the best interest of Ukraine and Russia is...
It's arguably not in the best... In fact, I'd completely disagree. It is not in America's best interest that this war stops in the way that you are intimating here. So it is in the best interest that it stops. That if stopping means Russia goes back to there, allows Ukraine to have its sovereign territory back, etc., etc., etc. That is in the best interest of the Ukraine. But what he's really meaning is because we've heard him say this explicitly before, which is freezing the front lines and then stopping the war, but not allowing Ukraine to join NATO and not allowing Ukraine to join the EU. That's what JD Vance has said before, and that's what he's leading to here. He doesn't say it here, but that's what he means. So it's in the best interest of America that Russia get to keep Ukrainian territory by invading and not being held accountable for doing that. So this is freaking horrific, in my opinion. And anyone like, hey, squeeze your head, squeeze your head. You know what? Sod off, matey. And people who are sucked in by this need to be far more critical in their analysis of what he's saying. On the other hand, and this is what I talk about, like that rhetoric is missing. I say what I like about Biden, but actually he said the right kind of things. Make no mistake, Russia will not win this war. The people of Ukraine will. And he's called Putin, and Harris has called Putin a murderous dictator. So you're like, oh, right, I know where you stand now. Like, there's a moral clarity there. There's no moral clarity with Vance and Trump. They've never said anything like that about Putin because they are beholden to Putin. Now, interesting piece here in the Telegraph. Russia is on the verge of collapse, says Samuel Romani. Europe cannot abandon targeted sanctions. So what we have heard from Trump is that he will reduce sanctions on... he said that at the Economic Club in New York. He said he would reduce sanctions. He said, I'm not a fan of sanctions. I'm a sanctions-like guy. And basically, explicitly said that he would reduce sanctions on Russia. But actually, this is the time you want to keep sanctions as tight as possible because Russia are creaking. So what do we have here? As key sectors of its civilian economy stagnate, it is more reliant than ever on its bloated military budget to sustain growth. Even with the defence sector, Russia has 400,000 fewer workers than it needs and severely lags in industrial economies many industrial economies in automation. A combination of labour shortages, rising prices and foreign capital flight could lead to a bursting of Russia's defence industrial boom in the coming year. Tighter sanctions would make Russia's economic outlook even more pessimistic and raise the cost of aggression against Ukraine. Europe needs to present a unified front against Russia's shadow fleet of oil tankers and front companies that do Russia's bidding. In December 2022, the G7, EU and Australia jointly imposed a $60 per barrel price cap on Russian oil. Russia responded by investing more than $10 billion into antiquated, uninsured oil tankers and used the shadow fleet to sell vast quantities of oil at higher prices. In June 2024, Kiev School of Economics, KSE, a report revealed that Russia's shadow fleet oil exports had doubled in a year to 4.1 million barrels per day. So on and so forth, blah, blah, blah. But basically talks about how it is, it is on the edge. And I think Russia is precariously balanced economically speaking. And I've also talked about how the Treasury, the US Treasury, is doing yeoman's job there, like a really significant job it plays a huge role in this war, the US Treasury, as well as the EU. Sanctions are an absolutely vital part of this war, and they are constant. You have to constantly be closing down loopholes and doing this and doing that and adding more sanctions and looking at that individual and looking at that entity and investigating how this person has exported that to there, to there, to there, to there. It is a massively involved job to keep on top of these. But it is super important because if you don't do that, Russia is able to finance the war ad infinitum. So important, this element. And when you have one of the nominees for president of the US saying that he's going to lift sanctions, there's no point support. There's no point supporting the war, Ukraine, with weapons if you're not going to support it with targeted sanctions. It's that simple. It's all or nothing in my books. And if you release sanctions, then what's the freaking point of all of it? And also, it's just wrong. It's just outright strategically, economically, geopolitically, morally wrong for Trump to do something like that. So here we have Prune60 saying Russia actually not them, but Rostec CEO. That's the defense industry CEO. So we just heard about like its reliance on the defense industry, military industrial complex in order to keep its GDP up and look like it's doing well. I heard from some troll that was banging on about how wonderful the Russian economy was on my threads yesterday. And it's like, mate, sod off. Don't waste your breath with me, mate. It's not a wonderful economy. It's in all sorts of trouble. So most enterprises will go bankrupt, says the Rostec CEO. So when a troll comes on and says, oh, the Russian economy is doing amazingly, GDP better than the rest of the world, you're like, what's your Rostec CEO just said? Warns of a threat of a collapse of Russian industry. I mean, because I think he knows a little bit better than you knobend. Sorry, I'm tired. And trolls annoy me. Sergei Chemezov was referring to the effects caused by high cost of borrowing. But there was a surprise fact in this article worth noting. And the article, most enterprises will go bankrupt. Rostec CEO warns of threat of collapse of Russian industry. According to Gazprom Bank's Center for Economic Forecasting, quote, half of all corporate loans in the economy have a floating rate tied to the central bank's key rate. It's not just a matter of not borrowing more money, it's also money they borrowed in the past. The interest rate is already in your book. So, however, rising loans pose risks, write analysts at Gazprom Bank's Center for Economic Forecasting. According to their estimates, half of all corporate loans in the economy have a floating rate tied to the central bank's key rate. But what you also need to remember is that the Russian government has increasing costs to fund their wars, so they're taking bigger cuts out of the economy. So it's not just higher costs of lending, it's higher taxes too. So you're getting hit both ways. In order to borrow money, it's much more expensive. And then, when you do your business, you're getting higher tax. So you're just getting whacked from both sides. Now we hear that, where is it? Yeah. So speaking of the central bank rates, they've raised them to 21%, 2% to 21%. This matches Sberbank's analyst projections. This is the highest value since 2013. It's absolutely astounding. Supermarkets are now removing butter from shelves in Russia to prevent it from being stolen. In a photo in Dixie in St. Petersburg, where only price tags remain on the shelves and customers are asked to contact the employees directly for butter, prices for butter have increased by almost 30% in a year, and the choice has decreased, and there are no discounts due to producer costs, which is why it is often stolen. In addition, producers of Prostok Vashino, Selo Zelenoye and other brands have begun to notify retail chains that they are suspending production or reducing shipments of these products. The reason is a shortage of raw materials and rising costs. A number of companies who increase prices on dairy products in general are, and it talks about all those price increases. In response to rising butter prices, Russia will import it from India and Iran. The situation with the rising prices for butter is reminiscent of the recent story with eggs. The chairperson of the Council of Dairy Union of Russia, Rozal Koznazdor found a solution to the problem in searching for importers from other countries. It's noted that Indian and Iranian butter are not inferior in quality to domestic companies. Of course, they're going to say that. But yeah, if you remember when they had this problem with eggs, they started getting eggs in from, I think, Iran as well there. So anyway, all is not well with the Russian economy. Just to go back a little bit to NATO, I should have had this in the last part, actually. This is just a kind of memey sort of tweet, but it's really, really important that you remember this and use this as ammunition against people who argue about NATO expansionism, that NATO expansionism causes war, that the war in Ukraine was caused by NATO expansionism. NATO expansionism, if you even think that this is NATO going and getting other countries when it never is, it's other countries going to NATO. So the whole principle of NATO expansionism is problematic anyway. It's a mischaracterization of what actually happens. But look, this is Eastern Europe explained. Finland, NATO, peace. Sweden, NATO, peace. Estonia, NATO, peace. Latvia, Romania, Norway, Bulgaria, Turkey, Greece, Czechia, Slovakia, Hungary, Germany, peace. Peace, 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 peace. They are not at war. Ukraine notwithstanding. Ukraine, no NATO, war with Russia. Georgia, no NATO, local war with Russia. In fact, Russia have taken two parts, Abkhazia and South Ossetia. Moldova, no NATO, local war with Russia. Russia they own Transnistria, essentially. Belarus, no NATO, occupied by Russia, effectively under the control of Russia. Chechnya, no NATO, occupied by Russia. And in, Georgia and Chechnya and Ukraine have all been invaded by Russia formally. Well, all of the, Moldova, you can argue, and Belarus. Yeah, so sorry, but you're a total fool if you believe that no NATO means more peace. The idea that NATO causes wars rather than stops wars is ridiculous, and it doesn't track with reality. Okay, so talking about NATO, let's go to John Bolton, former National Security Advisor.
I think it's very likely Trump will withdraw from NATO. I think this would be a catastrophic mistake for the United States.
So on and so forth. You can go and listen to another minute of him talking about that. But yeah, I mean, the reality on the ground is that most analysts and most people that worked with Trump in the last administration in this kind of capacity think that he would be a disaster for foreign diplomacy and for remaining in NATO. You go and have your vote, do whatever you like, but don't think for a second that Trump's going to be good for Ukraine and for NATO and for global security, actually. And there is already evidence that Russia is, obviously there's lots of evidence that Russia is interfering with the US election in terms of disinformation. There's a video showing mail-in ballots being destroyed in Bucks County, Pennsylvania. It is fake, and yes, it was created by the Russians. The Storm 1516 narrative appeared less than 3 hours ago, and it's already been shared on Twitter by tens of thousands of people. It's going to be a rough couple of weeks. So here we've got some 1776 blue tick accounts on Twitter saying, breaking, destruction of Trump mail-in ballots caught on camera in Bucks County, PA. This shocking footage must be investigated immediately. If true, this could be a serious threat to the integrity of the election. It's becoming clearer that this is the only way Democrats think they can win this election. So what you're doing, we've heard this from Trump already, but we're now seeing it from Russian disinformation, supporting the fact that it's just simply physically impossible for the Democrats to win the election. The only way that they can win the election is if they cheat. And therefore, if they win the election, they've done it by cheating, and therefore it should be turned over. This is giving a permission structure for people to challenge the election, either legally or in terms of protests, as soon as the election takes place. That is what happens when you allow Russia to manipulate the people on places like Twitter, to use freedom of speech and the freedoms of a country to be able to sow havoc. So disinformation or havoc. Just a warning. Right, moving on. Speaking of freaking which, this is the big news today. Elon Musk, the world's richest man and linchpin of the US space efforts, has been in regular contact with Russian President Vladimir Putin since late 2022. At one point, Putin asked the billionaire to avoid activating his Starlink satellite internet service over Taiwan as a favour to Chinese leader Xi Jinping, said two people briefed on the request. As Pekka Kaliniemi says, holy shit, Elon and Putin have been talking regularly since the end of 2022. It's worth reminding ourselves that Musk has been awarded various classified US government projects. He's a contractor to the US government. Not just any old contractor, not like a building contractor, but with Pentagon and NASA in terms of the framework for information and intelligence, like satellite networks. And allegedly has a security clearance. For example, Putin asked Elon to Starlink in Taiwan as a favour, to stop Starlink in Taiwan as a favour to the Chinese leader. Elon also spoke to Sergei Kiriyenko, who's created fake news websites to spread Russian disinformation, also on Twitter, and anti-Ukraine propaganda. Right, so the Wall Street Journal story. Let's have a little look at this. It is freaking... Right. So let's pick out some of the important Important paragraphs. Musk has formed deep business ties with US military and intelligence agencies, giving him unique visibility with some of America's most sensitive space programs. SpaceX, which operates the Starlink service, won a $1.8 billion classified contract in 2021 and is a primary rocket launcher for the Pentagon and NASA. Musk has a security clearance that allows him to access to certain classified information. During his campaign swing through Pennsylvania last week, it says later, Musk talked about the importance of government transparency and noted his own access to government secrets. Quote, I do have top secret clearance, but I'd have to say, like most of the stuff that I'm aware of, the reason they keep it top secret is because it's so boring. Of course, he's playing down the fact that he just does have that access. So it goes on later. So apart from that, he said Dmitry Peskov has said that neither Putin nor Kremlin officials were holding regular conversations with Musk, but this is not what the article is otherwise claiming. Up here we have, it's emerged that Elon Musk, the world's richest man and linchpin of the US space efforts, has been in regular contact with the Russian President Vladimir Putin since late 2022. The discussions, confirmed by several current and former US, European and Russian officials, touched on personal topics, business and geopolitical tensions. At one point, Putin asked the billionaire to avoid activating his Starlink satellite service over Taiwan as a favor to Chinese leader Xi Jinping. Just absolutely incredible. As we come down here, Musk has long had a fascination with Russia and its space and rocket programs. Walter Isaacson's biography of Musk said the businessman travelled to Moscow in 2002 to negotiate the purchase of rockets for his fledgling space program, but passed out during a vodka-heavy lunch. The sale ultimately failed, though his Russian hosts gave Musk a bottle of vodka with his likeness superimposed on a drawing of Mars. The billionaire's conversations with Putin and Kremlin officials highlight his increasing inclination to stretch beyond business and into geopolitics. He has met several times and talked with business with Javier Milei of Argentina, as well as former Brazilian President Jair Bolsonaro, with whom he defended in an acrimonious online debate. Of course, this is all skirting very close to, or actually being in contravention of the Logan Act, where an individual can't be basically doing diplomacy on behalf of the US without permission from the US. Putin is on a different order of magnitude, though. The Russian leader has created an authoritarian system that oversees fraudulent elections and the assassinations of political opponents, for which President Biden called him a killer. With keys to one of the world's most powerful nuclear arsenals and growing territorial ambitions in Europe, Putin has become the US's chief antagonist. Labeling him a despot, the Treasury Department took out the unusual step in 2022 of blacklisting him for invading Ukraine, putting him on the same company as North Korea's Kim Jong-un, Syrian President Bashar al-Assad and Alexander Lukashenko of Belarus. In October 2022, Musk said publicly that he had spoken only once to Putin. He had said on X that the conversation was about space and that it occurred in April 2021. But more conversations have followed, including dialogues with other high-ranking Russian officials past 2022 and into this year. One of the officials was Sergei Kirienko, Putin's first deputy chief of staff. Two of the officials said what the two talked about isn't clear. So this is the guy that's involved in Russian disinformation. Last month, the US Justice Department said in an affidavit that Kirienko had created some 30 internet domains to spread Russian disinformation, including on Musk's Twitter, where it was meant to erode support for Ukraine and manipulate American voters ahead of the presidential election. This is freaking compromise of American platforms and an American of the most important, powerful man, you can argue, in the world, certainly outside of political leadership. It's absolutely unconscionable that this has been taking place. After the Russian invasion of February 2022, Musk at first made strong public statements of support for Kyiv. He posted "Hold Strong Ukraine," flanked by Ukrainian flags, on what was still then known as Twitter. Shortly after, he jokingly challenged Putin to one-on-one combat over Ukraine, the Ukrainian language name for the country. He followed up by donating several hundred Starlink terminals to Ukraine. By July, some 15,000 terminals were providing free internet across a broad swaths of the country destroyed by Russian attacks. Later that year, Musk's view of the conflict appeared to change. He went like full 180. In September, Ukrainian military operatives weren't able to use Starlink terminals to guide sea drones to attack a Russian naval base in Crimea, a Black Sea peninsula Moscow had occupied since 2014. Ukraine tried to persuade Musk to activate the Starlink servers in the area, but that didn't happen, the journal has reported. And of course, he's allowed that to be active in Donetsk and Luhansk, occupied Donetsk and Luhansk. So you can use Starlink in those areas where it could easily be geofenced, but Musk is allowing that. Why? That only benefits the Russians. So it's clear that Musk wants to benefit the Russians. His space company extended instructions on the use of Starlink in offensive operations by Ukraine. Musk said later he had made the move because Starlink is meant for civilian uses and that he believed any Ukrainian attack on Crimea could spark a nuclear war. But he's fine with it being used by the Russians in Luhansk and Donetsk. His moves coincided with public and private pressure from the Kremlin, and this is the point. In May 2022, Russia's space chief said in a post on Telegram that Musk would answer like an adult for supplying Starlink to Ukraine's Azov battalion, which the Kremlin had singled out for ultra-right ideology as espoused by some members. Of course, that's debunked now. Later in 2022, Musk was having regular conversations with, quote, high-level Russians, according to a person familiar with the interactions. At the time, there was pressure from the Kremlin on Musk's businesses and implicit threats against him, the person said. At the same time, Musk increasingly took to Twitter, for which he was completing the purchase, to say SpaceX was losing money by funding the operation of the terminals. In October 2022, he asked his tens of millions of followers on Twitter to vote on a pathway to peace that mirrored some aspects of Kremlin's offer to Ukraine at the time. Those conditions included continued Russian occupation of Crimea and Ukrainian neutrality outside of NATO. He also specified that Ukraine should continue allowing the supply of water to Crimea, an issue that has been an important concern of the Kremlin before the war. And why would you say that a nation that has invaded part of your country, taken control of part of it, should be supplied water by your nation so that they can irrigate their crops? That you should give your river water as irrigation to them, the invader? Like, it blows my mind, but that is what Musk is espousing. One current and former intelligence source said that Musk and Putin have continued to have contact since then and into this year, and when Musk began stepping up his criticism of the US military aid to Ukraine and became involved in Trump's election campaign. And then it goes on and on. You've got about this is actually it's all really important. I'll read this a little bit. So, in the autumn of 2022, political scientist Ian Bremner, founder of the New York-based consulting firm Eurasia Group, wrote on Twitter that Musk had told him that he had spoken with Putin and Kremlin officials about Ukraine. He also told me that what Kremlin's red lines were, he wrote. Bremner wrote in a newsletter to subscribers that Musk had relayed to him in a message from Putin that Russia would secure Crimea and Ukrainian neutrality no matter what, and that it would respond to a Ukrainian invasion of Crimea with a nuclear strike. Musk said that everything needed to be done to avoid that outcome, Bremner wrote. So in other words, these threats are coming to Musk from Putin. Musk has publicly denied he said any of those things to Bremner. In the past year, Musk and Russia's interests have increasingly overlapped. Apart from Russia's use of Twitter for disinformation and Musk's outspoken opposition to aid to Kiev, Ukrainian officials said earlier this year that Russian forces occupying the country's eastern and southern swaths had started using Starlink to enable secure communications and extend the range of their drones. Russian troops also began using Starlink terminals brought in through third countries on a massive scale, undermining one of Ukraine's few battlefield advantages. Musk has said on Twitter that, to the best of his knowledge, no terminals have been sold directly or indirectly to Russia, and that the terminals wouldn't work inside Russia, but of course they work inside the occupied territories, and that's the key point. Pentagon officials have said that the military was working with Ukraine and Starlink to address the issue and described SpaceX as a great partner in those efforts. People familiar with the situation have said controlling who is using Starlink in Ukraine is difficult. Starlink has said on Twitter that when SpaceX learns of claims that unauthorized parties are using the service, it investigates and can cut off access. But does it do it? And that's a question, and the Ukrainians are claiming that that's not the case. Earlier this year, Musk gave airtime to Putin and his views on the US and Ukraine when X carried Tucker Carlson. Remember, X is the platform for Tucker Carlson's shows. Carried his 2-hour interview with the Russian leader inside the Kremlin. In the interview, Putin said he was sure Musk was a smart person, and so on and so forth. It's all terrible. And rightly so, people say, as Yoni Escola here says, the pieces are coming together. The richest man in the world backs Trump in every possible way, including illegal ones, while both of them promote Kremlin talking points and have secret communications with the Kremlin at the same time. Coincidence? I don't think so. As stated by War Translated, the pieces are coming together. The Wall Street Journal reported, citing unnamed official sources, that Elon Musk has been in regular communication, etc., etc. And then, we've got some of this evidence of what Musk has been saying and how he's changed his opinion. And then it gets to the point where Musk has got a super PAC, the America PAC, supporting Donald Trump. He put $70 million in it last week, and then just yesterday, I think he put in another 38 million or something like $118 million. Musk has put towards Trump's campaign. And so you've got, it's all these connections. You've got Musk compromised by Russia and Tucker Carlson compromised by Russia. As I've said before, his dad's on the board of the lobbying company that lobbies for Viktor Orban, and Heritage Foundation, taking money through the Bethany Foundation, Danube Institute from Russia, through the propaganda arms of the Hungarian government, through to the Heritage Foundation. The Heritage Foundation writing the Project 2025, which is Trump's blueprint for ruling when he gets into power, if he's voted in November. So there you've got one connection to Trump there, and you've got Elon Musk putting $118 million into Trump's coffers, having private phone calls to Putin allowed to use Twitter to disinform the American electorate, while Starlink is being utilized in a way that is suboptimal for the Ukrainians. Blows my mind. Blows my freaking mind. Given how much October the 7th helped Russia with Ukraine, the conclusion is obvious. What's Dmitry from War Translated talking about? So another Wall Street Journal article talks about, and I'll do this really, really super quickly, but basically the Yemeni Houthis data from satellites has to strike these these cargo ships. Up to 100 ships have been targeted by the Houthis during this campaign of war against trade going through the Red Sea. How are the Houthis, how are these rebels, A, getting hold of these weapons, and B, being able to target moving ships? And the Wall Street Journal has come out in their piece saying that Russia's provided targeting data for Houthi assaults on global shipping. So you can think that we're not involved in a world war, and then you understand how Russia is involved with the elections in the US, the elections in Moldova, the elections in the EU, the Brexit election or referendum, in invading Ukraine, in invading Chechnya and Georgia, and involved in the Georgian Dream political party. They have two parts of Georgia under their control. They have many parts of Ukraine under their control, one part of Moldova under their control. They have Hungary and Slovakia under their control, effectively. Belarus under their control. They are involved with BRICS and China with the Shanghai Cooperation Agreement, all vying against the US and Western intentions. And then Russia involved in the Sahel region with providing security for all these juntas where there have been 7 different coups over the last few years, and Russia's taking out blood diamonds and uranium and etc. etc. This is war, guys, and Russia are involved in virtually every aspect of whatever's going on in the world at the moment. And that you would have some people say in the US, I'd rather have Putin as president than Biden. Freaking blows my mind. I can't. Like, people need to understand what's going on here. This is a serious point in history. We're at an inflection point, a really volatile and violent point in human history at the moment, where violence seems to be back on the agenda. We thought World War II had taught us a lesson. It hasn't. And Russia are at the heart of everything that's bad at the moment. And we need to have governments that are strong enough to recognise that overtly and frickin' do something about it. Enough said. That's enough of me. Take care. Speak soon.